What if the biggest threat to Rome wasn't barbarians, but a teenage emperor? They feared the Goths and the legions, but the greatest terror of Rome arrived as a 14-year-old boy. You won't believe what this emperor did that historians tried to hide. History attempted to erase him, but the whispers of what he did in the Senate and the Temple still echo through the Palatine Hill. What did the air in the Roman court smell like under a teenage emperor? The scent of frankincense and the metallic tang of fear. This was the atmosphere of the Roman court under the boy emperor. How did the most powerful man on earth cause a crisis by changing his name? The most powerful man on earth preferred to be called mistress. This was the profound crisis that shook the foundations of the Republic. Why did the senators have to hold their breath waiting for the empire to crack? Imagine the forced silence of the senators, compelled to watch their sovereign dance around a black stone, waiting for the empire to break. Discover the emperor history tried to delete. We begin not with conquest, but with a calculated effort at deletion. Certain reigns are so deeply unsettling, so challenging to the established order, that history itself attempts to seal them away. For many in Rome, the name of Elagabalus belongs to this shadowed history, an emperor who, in their view, should never have been recorded at all. The very mention of his 3-year rule triggered a collective visceral rejection among the Senate and the conservative elite, who witnessed acts of power and ritual so alien, so transgressive, that it felt like the dissolution of Roman identity itself. Realizing this was not merely misrule, but the sacred turned profane, why Rome tolerated vice but rebelled against a priest-emperor is key to understanding this aversion. To understand this aversion, one must grasp the delicate balance of Roman tolerance. The ruling class was accustomed to the extravagance of their sovereigns. Sensuous claims, forbidden indulgence, and private vice were often tolerated, provided the public duties were maintained. But the young man who arrived in Rome as the high priest of a foreign sun god shattered this unspoken contract. His offenses were not simply personal, they were acts of state, ritual designed to overturn centuries of Roman tradition. When you step into his court, you realize that the horror was not the vice, but the total, unapologetic shift in power's center. Find out how a black stone shaped the Roman Empire. His birth name was Sextus Varius Avitus Bassianus, arriving in the world around 204 AD. His connection to the imperial line was through his mother, Julia Soaemius, a distant relative of the former emperor Caracalla, ensuring a tenuous claim to legitimacy. More significant, perhaps, was his heritage. On his father's side, which granted him the hereditary priesthood of Elagabalus, the sun god of Emesa. This foreign devotion, this unwavering connection to a deity symbolized by a sacred black conical meteorite, would become the defining and ultimately destructive force of his reign. As you are watching a priest, not an emperor, ascend the throne, learn the ruthless family strategy that put a teen on the throne. The family's exile came swiftly in 217 AD after Caracalla's tragic end and the ascent of the Praetorian prefect, Macrinus. But the transfer of power was fragile, and Macrinus's grip on the legions proved insufficient. In 218 AD, through a calculated, ruthless effort by the powerful women of his family, specifically his formidable grandmother, Julia Meseth, young Bassianus was presented to the legions. He was cynically presented as the true, legitimate son of Caracalla, thereby justifying the overthrow of Macrinus. At the shockingly fragile age of 14, Elagabalus was elevated to the highest office in the Western world, unknowingly inheriting a crown forged in deceit and destined for chaos. What happened when Rome was ruled by a boy devoted to a foreign god? What happens when the ultimate power is handed to a boy whose true devotion lies in a foreign cult? A boy unburdened by Roman conservatism. The consequences were immediate and profound. Initially, his mother and grandmother attempted to stabilize his rule, even achieving the unprecedented and utterly scandalous feat of attending sessions of the Roman Senate. This violation of dignity, this public display of female political influence was seen as a grave offense by the traditionalists. Yet even the formidable ambition of the Julia women could not contain the torrent of Elagabalus' unique vision for the empire. How one teenager tried to destroy Roman identity with a temple. The ancient accounts, often colored by malice, suggest a ruler defined by extreme indulgence, unpredictable cruelty, and an almost manic sense of playful malice. Yet his first act wasn't a purge or a reform. It was an act of profound piety, entirely centered on his Syrian deity. The emperor commanded the construction of a magnificent temple, the Elagabalus, on the Palatine Hill. This structure was not merely a house of worship. It was intended to be the spiritual nexus of the entire Roman world, subordinating all other gods and cults beneath the black stone of Emesa. See how a single temple turned the sacred geography of Rome upside down. Imagine the sacred geography of Rome being fundamentally altered, its established divine hierarchy turned upside down. The Elagabalus was ruthlessly positioned to dominate the religious landscape, and the most sacred objects of Rome, including the Vestal Virgins, fire, and even the Palladium, the legendary statue of Pallas, were forcibly relocated to his new shrine. New information suggests that Elagabalus compelled even the most venerated Roman senators to participate in his rites, forcing them to observe him, the emperor dancing around the meteorite during the summer solstice. This enforced participation was a chilling statement of absolute ritualistic power. The secret reason the emperor moved from religion to extreme indulgence, this total uncompromising elevation of the sun god, was merely the public face of the profound shifts occurring within the imperial court as the transition from Roman emperor to high priest of Emesa was complete. Yet the sources that chronicle this period suggest that the violations extended far beyond religious boundaries, and what came next changed everything. The emperor turned his focus from the sacred black stone to the darker, more unsettling recesses of forbidden indulgence and personal identity. The scandalous public desires of a Roman emperor exposed the historical record, while likely exaggerated by Roman moralists, paints a striking picture of Elagabalus's relationship with physical desire. He was said to possess an insatiable appetite, not limiting himself to traditional partnerships, and the ancient accounts emphasize his particular fascination with charioteers, men whose raw physicality and public prowess seemed to excite him most profoundly. For a Roman ruler, this public elevation of a person from the lowest strata of society was arguably more scandalous than any private vice. How a Roman emperor shocked his citizens with crude political appointments. You must understand the context. Political appointments, even under the most corrupt emperors, maintained a veneer of gravitas. But Elagabalus, according to his chroniclers, used criteria for office that were shocking in their crude simplicity, selecting individuals based purely on physical attributes. He was engaging in more acts of forbidden indulgence during his 3-year reign than many expected from a man of any age, let alone an adolescent, making this period of rule synonymous with unrestrained appetite, undermining the very notion of imperial dignity. The day the emperor became a streetwalker, a radical public violation. But the transgressions of power went further than mere indulgence. They entered the realm of deliberate, performative gender subversion. It is recounted that the emperor would venture out into the city's shadows disguised in wigs and clothing traditionally forbidden to Roman men. He reportedly displaced the practitioners of the notorious pleasure houses and assumed the role himself, standing naked at the doorway of a reserved palace chamber. Imagine the sight. The emperor, the embodiment of Roman law, soliciting bystanders, shaking the gold-ringed curtain like a common harlot, in a radical public violation of Roman societal dignity. Meet the charioteer who became the wife of the Roman emperor. Amongst this continuous cycle of partners, one individual stood apart, Hierocles, a male servant. This relationship transcended mere physical engagement and became the centerpiece of an imperial drama that drove the establishment into a state of furious, terrified confusion. Elagabalus first encountered Hierocles during a public game, after the servant was thrown from his chariot, revealing a strikingly appealing countenance. The emperor's delight was immediate, and he commanded the charioteer be brought to the palace instantly to disperse his favors. Why the emperor demanded to be called "my lady" by his officials? The emotional intensity of this bond was such that Elagabalus, the living vessel of the state, publicly embraced an identity that defied all Roman norms. He reportedly instructed his officials to address him as "my lady" during formal meetings, correcting them if they used the masculine pronoun. The emperor allegedly declared his pride in being called the wife, mistress, and queen of Hierocles. While ancient Rome had no legal framework for such unions, the public ceremony and the emperor's insistence on the title of wife represented an unprecedented challenge to the gendered hierarchical structure of Roman society. The bizarre rumor that drove the Senate to panic: the gender of the emperor. This obsession with female roles and identity fueled the wildest rumors and propaganda. Cassius Dio, a contemporary observer, spearheaded the narrative that the emperor was fundamentally questioning his own biological sex. It was alleged, and modern historians treat this with extreme caution, often attributing it to malicious slander, that Elagabalus offered vast sums to doctors to perform a primitive form of surgical transformation. Even if untrue, the mere existence of these rumors demonstrates the profound anxiety he instilled. The scandal of the emperor who refused to take off women's clothes. The public fascination was intensified by his penchant for cross-dressing outside of accepted ritual holidays like the Saturnalia. While disguise was permitted during these specific festivals, the emperor's year-round adoption of women's attire, wigs, elaborate dresses, and allegedly even fake breasts, was seen as a dangerous structural breakdown of identity. He was often accused of effeminacy, a damning label in the Roman world. The provocative portrait the emperor sent to warn Rome of his arrival, Eric Varner, a modern scholar, notes the extent of this performance, alleging that Elagabalus appeared in the guise of Venus and had his entire body epilated. Furthermore, a highly stylized, perhaps deliberately provocative portrait of the emperor was sent ahead to the capital before his arrival in Rome. This calculated measure was meant to acclimatize the inhabitants to his exotic and unsettling appearance, a visual warning that the established norms were already dissolving. How a grandmother engineered the ultimate imperial betrayal. While Elagabalus focused on his rituals and his deeply personal explorations of identity, the political wheels of the empire continued to turn, driven by his pragmatic, terrified family. Julia Maesa, the grandmother who had maneuvered him onto the throne, realized the extreme instability his behavior created. The Senate's hatred was palpable. They would have preferred anyone else to occupy the throne, as the crisis of legitimacy had reached a boiling point. The genius political move that placed an antidote next to the poison. Maesa understood that the survival of the dynasty depended on replacing the deeply compromised young man with a safer, more palatable candidate. Her choice fell upon another grandson, Severus Alexander. She engineered a plan persuading Elagabalus to adopt Alexander as his heir, ostensibly to share the overwhelming burden of the empire. This action was the ultimate political camouflage, a strategic move that placed the popular conservative antidote within striking distance of the poison. The moment the legions abandoned the sun god, Emperor Alexander, guided by Maesa, did the bare minimum required to contrast starkly with Elagabalus. He was presented as modest, traditional, and respectful of the Roman deities and the Senate. The legions, growing tired of the sun god's foreign rites and the instability of the court, began to shift their loyalty. The political maneuver was succeeding. Elagabalus found his support rapidly evaporating, turning his imperial palace into a hostile cage. The terrifying isolation of the teenage emperor, betrayed by his own family, driven by paranoia and resentment, the emperor realized the deadly threat his adopted son posed. He attempted to purge the problem, formulating multiple plans to assassinate Alexander. But these desperate, poorly executed efforts were transparent to Maesa and the now fiercely protective Praetorian Guard. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching, and the young emperor found himself entirely isolated within the massive, cold walls of his own Palatine residence. The shocking place the Roman emperor was found hiding when his reign ended. The tension broke in 222 CE. A contingent of the Praetorian Guard, swayed by Maesa's influence and Alexander's growing popularity, moved against the emperor. It is a striking historical irony that the absolute ruler of Rome, the man who styled himself the earthly embodiment of the sun god, met his tragic end while attempting to hide. The brutal, undignified end of the ruler who demanded to be called my lady. The accounts record that Elagabalus was found concealed in a latrine, a cramped, undignified end for a man who demanded the world address him as my lady. His mother, Julia Soamius, who had navigated the treacherous political currents alongside him, was also condemned. The soldiers, contemptuous of the failed regime, dragged their bodies from their hiding place. This sudden silence that followed the seizure of the emperor was deafening, marking the definitive failure of his controversial reign. The chilling way Rome ensured the emperor was publicly degraded. The brutal post-mortem treatment of the emperor was designed to be the ultimate public degradation, a calculated act intended to obliterate any memory of his illegitimate rule. His corpse was dragged through the unforgiving streets of Rome, a shocking spectacle witnessed by the very citizens he had both delighted and offended. The visual cues of his downfall were deliberate. This was the destruction of a tyrant, not the respectful burial of a sovereign. Why the body of the emperor was thrown into the river, his final resting place, or lack thereof, was the most enduring symbol of his failure. The body of the emperor was ultimately disposed of by being dumped into the Tiber River. Accounts differ, but some suggest it was first thrown into the massive main sewer of the city, the Cloaca Maxima, before ending up in the river's murky flow. This act sealed his fate, denying him the sanctity of proper burial and subjecting his memory to the most profound historical contempt. The official obliteration. How Rome tried to erase Elagabalus from history. This was the damnatio memoriae, enacted not just by decree but by visceral, popular, and military disgust. His name was systematically chipped away from monuments, his statues were destroyed, and the Senate officially declared him an anomaly, a ruler who should be forgotten. He was meant to vanish into the flow of the Tiber and the shadows of history, leaving no trace. The hidden reason history couldn't completely forget the sun god emperor. Yet the attempt to erase Elagabalus was only partially successful. The sensational nature of his reign, the religious fanaticism, the challenging of gender norms, and the utter breakdown of imperial expectation ensured that whispers of his name continued to circulate. His story became a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when unbridled adolescent power clashes with the rigid foundation of an ancient empire. The truth behind the boy priest who used the throne for self-discovery, the quiet historians who sift through the fragmented, often biased accounts of this period, find a deeply complex figure. A boy who was arguably more devoted to his priesthood than his emperorship. A ruler who used the seat of world power to explore the contours of his own identity. His reign, though brief, provides a vital, disturbing window into the fragility of power and the intense psychological pressure inherent in the Roman purple. This is why we must study controversial figures like Elagabalus. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict without depicting explicit or graphic events. The story of Elagabalus serves as a powerful reminder that history is not always written by the victors, but sometimes by the deeply shocked observers. The tragic lesson of the emperor who tried to shake the foundations of Rome, the ultimate tragedy of Elagabalus, is perhaps not the manner of his death, but the indelible way he proved that even the most extravagant displays of power can be violently overturned by tradition and political expediency. The foundations he sought to shake ultimately collapsed upon him. If you understand the fragility of power, you need to watch this next. If this story made you reflect on the fragility of power, stay with us for the next chapter. We continue to walk further into history's shadows where the truth of the past is often stranger and far darker than any fiction.